Have you ever felt like you were playing a part, a role in a tense meeting before the watchful eyes of a superior, or even with those you claim to love the most? We, in this life, all possess a collection of masks. The mask of confidence to hide the trembling fear within, the mask of cheerfulness to conceal a breaking heart, the mask of compliance to silently bide our time. We wear them to survive, to advance, to be accepted. It is a silent dance in which we all participate. But what happens when a man does not merely join the dance, but becomes its master? What happens when he wears these masks for so long, so skillfully, that he forgets his own face beneath them? And most terrifying of all, what happens when the final mask he chooses to don is the mask of a god? The story today is not merely about a death recorded in the annals of history. No, it is far deeper and more alarming than that. It is the story of a life meticulously constructed upon roles, a kingdom built by the power of masks, and a terrifying collapse when the stage curtain was ripped asunder by an unseen hand. We are about to step into the world of Herod Agrippa I, a name that echoes through history not only for the power he held, but for the catastrophic way he lost it. Imagine, not through the dry pages of a textbook, but with your own mind's eye. Picture a man born into the colossal and brutal shadow of his grandfather, Herod the Great. A bloody legacy that should have crushed him, but it did not. From within that shadow, an extraordinary talent arose, an innate ability to charm the hearts of men, to read the deepest desires of both friend and foe. He could turn his enemies into his most loyal allies, and transform the suspicion of the masses into fervent adoration. He was a brilliant director, a consummate actor, a grand magician on the treacherous political stage of the first century. Every gesture, every word, every glance was perfectly calculated. He had turned his very life into a magnificent play, and he was its one and only star. But there is an ultimate rule, an immutable law upon the stage of life. A law that not even the most talented actor king can break. You can play any role, you can deceive any audience, but you may never ever play the role of the one who created the stage itself. For to do so is no longer acting. It is blasphemy. It is a challenge thrown to the very heavens. Join me now as we open the script to the final and most tragic act in the life of Herod Agrippa. We will pull back the velvet curtain of history, look behind the scenes, and witness the naked truth behind the splendid masks. Are you ready? Take a deep breath, because once this curtain is raised, you will never be able to look at power, applause, and pride in the same way again. The play is about to begin. To understand the master, we must return to his workshop. For Herod Agrippa, that workshop was not the dusty streets of Jerusalem, but the magnificent marble halls of Rome. His youth was not shaped by prayers in the temple, but by the calculated whispers in the palaces of Caesar. It was here, in the beating heart of the world's most powerful empire, that Agrippa learned the foundational lesson for all his future ambitions. True power does not flow through bloodlines. It is woven from the threads of cunning and manipulation. And it was here that he handcrafted and donned his first mask, a masterpiece of the art of survival, the Roman mask. Imagine the young Agrippa, a foreign prince, little more than a political hostage, thrown into a pool of sharks. He was surrounded by arrogant Roman nobles, powerful generals, and men who could end his life with a flick of the wrist. A weaker man would have shrunk, living a quiet life of fear. But not Agrippa. He watched, he listened, he learned. His Roman mask was not an inanimate object, it was alive. It was a perfectly timed smile for an influential senator. It was a subtle compliment on a general's military victory. It was the ability to debate Greek philosophy with the most brilliant minds, and then, in the next breath, discuss the latest gladiatorial games with passionate enthusiasm. Agrippa did not just assimilate, he charmed. He befriended the most powerful men, not through crude flattery, but by becoming a delightful and useful companion. He became a close friend of Caligula, the future mad and monstrous emperor. He earned the trust and affection of Claudius, a man who seemed weak but would eventually take the throne. To them, Agrippa was not a strange Jew. No, his mask was too perfect. He was one of them, a sophisticated nobleman, a reliable ally, and most importantly, a potential administrator who could keep the powder keg of Judea from exploding. This mask concealed every trace of his Jewish heritage, of a monotheistic faith the Romans always found strange and stubborn. He learned to bow gracefully before the Roman emperors, not with humiliation, but with a strategic intelligence, knowing that each bow was an investment in a future where others would have to bow before him. Do you see the sophistication in that? It was not just deceit, it was an art form, an art of survival elevated to a strategy. He turned his greatest weakness, his hostage status, into his greatest advantage. He understood Rome from the inside out. He knew how the machine of power worked. He knew who were friends, who were enemies, and who could be made into pawns. The Roman mask protected him, nurtured him, and finally, it gave him the key to return to his homeland, not as a failure, but as a king backed by Rome itself. But a mask, no matter how perfect, demands a price. The price of wearing it for too long is that you begin to feel more comfortable in it than in your own skin, and that was the first danger. A tiny crack that Agrippa, at the time, did not even notice. As the ships carrying Herod Agrippa returned to the port of Caesarea, a miraculous transformation took place. The salt air of the Mediterranean seemed to wash away the Roman dust from his being. As he set foot on the land of his ancestors, he carefully placed his sophisticated Roman mask into an invisible box. And from that box, he drew out another mask, one crafted with even greater skill, more splendor, and infinitely more persuasion. The Jewish mask. If in Rome he was a cosmopolitan politician, a friend of Caesar, then in Jerusalem he became a devout pilgrim, a son returning to the faith of his fathers. This change was not just in costume or behavior, it was a complete metamorphosis of character, at least on the surface. Imagine this shocking scene, a sight that spread through the streets of the holy city. The king, who everyone knew had just dined in luxury with the Roman emperor, who had grown up with pagan pastimes, was now walking barefoot on the hot flagstones of the temple courts. That humility, a perfectly calculated humility, touched the hearts of the common people. He did not just visit the temple, he inhabited it. He offered sacrifices not just as the law required, but far beyond expectation, bringing the finest sheep and bulls from the flock. His voice, accustomed to elegant Latin, now recited prayers in Hebrew with a palpable reverence. He sat for hours with the high priests and Torah scholars, not as a king issuing decrees, but as an eager student. He listened to them with wide-eyed admiration, nodding at their wise interpretations of the law. He attended every festival, from the solemnity of Passover to the joy of the Feast of Tabernacles, not as an outsider, but as an insider, a man whose soul seemed to have always belonged here. The people, who were so weary and disgusted with foreign rulers and the previous Herodian kings, who saw their nation merely as a source of tax revenue and the temple as a political tool, saw in Agrippa something different. They saw a flicker of hope. Finally, they whispered to one another in the marketplaces, "We have a king who is truly one of us, a king who fears God." This Jewish mask was too convincing, too perfect. It won him the boundless love of the people. It earned him the fervent support of the religious establishment, which had always been suspicious of the Herodians. Agrippa had accomplished the impossible. He was both the friend of Caesar in Rome and the hero of the faith in Jerusalem. He was walking a tightrope stretched between two completely opposite worlds, and he wasn't just walking, he was dancing upon it. But have you ever wondered, how long can a man live with two opposing faces, two opposing souls, before they begin to erode one another? Was there ever a moment, in the quiet of the night, when all the roles were stripped away, that Agrippa looked in the mirror and asked, Who am I, really? The Roman courtier or the Jewish devotee? Perhaps not. Perhaps by this point, he had begun to believe that he was, in fact, both. And that is precisely when the most dangerous self-deception begins to take root, preparing the ground for a crack that could never be mended. The applause of a crowd can be the sweetest melody a man in power can hear, but that same melody, if listened to for too long, can become a lullaby, singing reason and humility into a deep sleep. For Herod Agrippa, the unending praise from the people and the clergy was no longer just a reward for his brilliant performance. It had transformed, becoming something he craved, something he needed to survive, an addiction for his soul. And it was in this intoxication of adulation that the first crack appeared on the polished surface of his perfect masks. Agrippa was no longer just acting. He had begun to believe his own performance, absolutely. When he walked amidst the cheers of King Agrippa, defender of the faith, he no longer heard it as praise for his political savvy. He heard it as the truth. Pride, the serpent that had lain dormant in the garden of his soul, slithered out, raised its head, and began to whisper sweet poison into his ear. It said, "You are not just a king, you are an icon. You are the one chosen by God to lead this nation. Anyone who challenges you is challenging the will of God himself." And as it happened, or perhaps it was no coincidence at all, another story was beginning to be told in his kingdom. A small story, starting in the fishing villages of Galilee and now spreading through the alleys of Jerusalem. It was the story of a carpenter named Jesus who had been crucified but was said to have risen again. His followers, the adherents of the way, were speaking of another king, of another kingdom, not of this world. They did not challenge Agrippa with swords, but they challenged him with their very existence. They were performing a different play on his stage, a play in which Agrippa was not the main character. For a man accustomed to being the only star, this was unacceptable. Their play ruined his play. And so, the mask of piety, which had been used to charm the people, was now turned into a ruthless weapon. To solidify his role as defender of the faith, and to please the conservative Sadducees who disliked this new sect, Agrippa decided he must act. He needed a performance of power. He ordered the arrest of James, the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' 3 closest apostles. There was no lengthy trial, no debate, just a cold command. James was executed by the sword. It was not an act of faith or justice. It was a bloody gift offered to the audience he wanted to please. And when the news of James's death spread, the roar of approval from the powerful religious factions was sweeter than any music. Agrippa had tasted the sweetness of being hailed not just as a king, but as the arm of God on earth. He had drunk from the poisoned chalice of his own hubris. The crack in his mask had just grown wider, and through it, a cold darkness began to seep in. The success of the execution of James' play intoxicated Agrippa. The applause had validated his role. Now, he felt invincible, an all-powerful director on the stage of Judea. Emboldened by this acclaim, he decided it was time to stage an even grander production, a performance that would forever etch his name in history as the man who extinguished the infant threat to the traditional faith. His next target was none other than Simon Peter, the man the believers called the Rock, the undisputed leader of the early church in Jerusalem. The arrest of Peter was not a simple capture. No, for a master of theater like Agrippa, everything had to be symbolic, every action a carefully constructed message. Peter was arrested during the week of unleavened bread, a holy time, to emphasize that Agrippa was cleansing the land of what he considered heresy. And the way he imprisoned Peter revealed his intentions clearly. Imagine this almost obsessive arrangement, a setup designed to sow fear and hopelessness. Peter was not thrown into a common dungeon. He was bound with 2 heavy iron chains and placed between 2 guards right inside his own cell. This meant that even in his sleep, he had no moment of privacy or freedom. But Agrippa did not stop there. Outside the cell door, other guards stood watch. In total, 16 soldiers, divided into 4 squads of 4, took turns guarding a single, unarmed fisherman. Why was such extreme caution necessary? The answer is simple: because this was Herod Agrippa's stage. He didn't just want to imprison Peter's body, he wanted to imprison the hope of his followers. He wanted all of Jerusalem, from the most powerful members of the Sanhedrin to the common street vendors, to see that nothing and no one could escape his iron grip. He wanted to prove that even the man called the Rock would crumble into dust before his royal power. His plan was perfect. He would keep Peter imprisoned until after the Passover festival, and then he would bring him out for a public trial and execution. It would be the climax of his play, a public spectacle that would affirm his absolute status and crush this movement once and for all. In his palace, Agrippa likely smiled with satisfaction. All the pieces were in place. The script was written. The actors were in their roles. He, the brilliant director, just had to wait for the final act. He had forgotten the most basic rule of the cosmic stage. When you try to imprison God's purpose, you are not the jailer. You, in your pride, are the prisoner of your own plan, shackled by your own blind confidence. And while he slept in his illusion of absolute power, another hand, the hand of the supreme director, was preparing to rewrite the final scene of this play. While King Herod Agrippa slept soundly in silken sheets, complacent in the belief that his drama was unfolding perfectly, another director intervened. God's intervention did not come with the blast of trumpets or a terrifying earthquake. No, it came in the near-total silence of the night, a silence more powerful than any sound. It was a reminder that true power has no need to boast. Inside the cold, damp cell where Peter slept between 2 soldiers, a light suddenly shone. It was not the harsh glare of a torch, but a gentle, warm glow emanating from a being the guards apparently could not see. An angel of the Lord stood there, inside what was supposed to be Jerusalem's most secure prison. The angel did not shout. He simply nudged Peter in the side and said gently, "Get up quickly." In a daze, Peter opened his eyes. And then the miracle began to unfold, not with a clash of metal, but with an impossible ease. The heavy iron chains, which bound his hands to the 2 guards, were not broken. They simply slipped off and fell to the stone floor without making a sound. Imagine Peter's astonishment. He was told to put on his clothes and sandals. He was still half asleep, thinking he was seeing a vision. The angel led him out. They walked past the first set of guards, and then the second. These soldiers, the expensive props in Agrippa's play, the symbols of his power, remained perfectly still, like statues, their eyes open but unseeing, their ears present but unhearing. They were completely unaware of the prison break happening right before them. Finally, they came to the iron gate that led to the city. A massive, heavy gate that would require several strong men to push open. But as they approached, it swung open before them of its own accord, as smoothly as if it had been oiled. Peter and the angel walked out into the empty street, went on for 1 block, and then, suddenly, the angel was gone. Peter stood alone in the quiet night, feeling the cool breeze on his face. It was only then that he fully came to his senses. This was not a dream. He was free. He had left behind a fortress prison, a squad of guards, and a sleeping king. He had left behind an empty stage and a torn-up script. The next morning, when the news of the empty cell reached Agrippa, the palace shook, not from an earthquake, but from the king's fury. But it was not just the anger of a ruler who had been challenged. It was the supreme humiliation of a lead actor, a prideful director whose most important scene had been ruined by a force he could not see and could not comprehend. In a helpless rage, he ordered the interrogation and execution of the entire 16-man guard. He vented his anger on the pawns, but deep down, a cold feeling of dread must have begun to creep in. His play had an unexpected plot twist that he did not write. A clear warning had been delivered in the silence of the night. The question was, Would a man so drunk on applause still be sober enough to hear it? Or would he only become more determined to prove that he, and he alone, was in control? The humiliation and anger following Peter's escape did not lead Herod Agrippa to a moment of humble reflection. On the contrary, it was like throwing fuel onto the fire of pride that was already blazing within him. The incident in Jerusalem was a stain on the image of absolute power he had so carefully cultivated. He now felt an urgent need to stage an even grander performance, a play that could not be ruined, an event that would erase all doubt and reassert his unshakable position. He needed a new, more magnificent stage, and he found it in Caesarea Maritima. Caesarea, a splendid port city built by his own grandfather, Herod the Great, a city that was a perfect fusion of Roman architecture and the beauty of the Mediterranean coast. With its massive theatre, a grand hippodrome, and a palace overlooking the sea, this was the perfect stage for Agrippa's final and greatest performance. And a golden opportunity presented itself, a backdrop that could not have been more perfect for the upcoming drama. A conflict, a rift in diplomatic relations, had occurred between Agrippa and the two powerful commercial cities to the north, Tyre and Sidon. We do not know the exact cause. Perhaps it was a trade dispute, or perhaps it was simply the bruised ego of the king. But the result was that Agrippa had imposed an embargo, cutting off the essential supply of food from his territories to these two cities. Tyre and Sidon, though wealthy, could not grow their own food. They were completely dependent on the fields of Judea and Galilee. Famine began to loom. Storehouses emptied. Panic spread. Finally, left with no other choice, the leaders of Tyre and Sidon were forced to swallow their pride. They had to come, bowing and scraping, to beg for mercy from the king they had offended. This was the exact script Agrippa had been waiting for. He would not simply accept their apology in a closed room. No, that was too mundane. He would turn it into a public event. He would make them wait, make them plead through a trusted court official, Blastus. He would make them display their weakness and dependency before the entire world. And then, on a carefully chosen day, during a great festival held in honor of Emperor Claudius, he would appear before them and the public, not as a negotiator, but as a lord who dispensed life and death. Everything was meticulously prepared. The speeches were written, the flatteries were planted among the crowd, security was tightened, the stage in the great theatre of Caesarea was set. But there was one detail, one final element in Agrippa's preparation to which he gave special attention. It was not about words, but about image. It was the costume he would wear. It was not just clothing. No, it was a statement. It was his final, most glorious mask. A garment designed not for a king, but for a god. And as he put it on, he did not know that he was also putting on his own shroud. The dawn of the festival's second day broke, painting the Mediterranean Sea in hues of pink and gold. The air in Caesarea was electric, with excitement and tension. Crowds had gathered early at the massive open-air theatre, an impressive Roman structure that could hold thousands. They came not just to see the games, but to witness the ultimate political drama, the appearance of King Herod Agrippa, to deliver his verdict on the delegations from Tyre and Sidon. The very survival of two cities rested in the hands of one man. And then the moment arrived. Agrippa stepped onto the stage. A gasp of collective awe silenced the entire theatre. The king was not wearing the customary royal robes of purple linen or gold. Instead, as the historian Josephus recorded in vivid detail, he was clothed in a garment woven entirely of pure silver threads. Under the brilliant morning sun, the robe caught the light in a miraculous way. It did not just shine, it seemed to burn, throwing off thousands of dazzling diamond-like reflections that forced the onlookers to squint. Agrippa stood there, motionless for a moment, letting his surreal image sear itself into the minds of everyone present. He did not look like a man of flesh and blood. He looked like a statue forged from light, a deity stepping out of legend. After dazzling the crowd with his appearance, he began to speak. The content of his speech, likely a magnanimous pardon for Tyre and Sidon delivered with an air of superiority, almost ceased to matter. The image and the moment had decided everything. Mesmerized by his divine appearance and overwhelmed by his power, the crowd began to roar. Perhaps the words were planted by sycophants, or perhaps they erupted spontaneously from mass delusion. The shouts grew louder, echoing off the stone walls of the theater. The voice of a god, and not of a man. This was it, the defining moment of Agrippa's entire life, the culmination of every role, every mask, every calculation. His whole life had led to this second, where mortals were worshipping him as divine. History held its breath. He had a choice, one final fork in the road. He could have raised a hand, silenced the crowd, and said the simple but life-saving words, "Number, I am only a man. All glory belongs to God alone." A small act of humility could have saved him, but he did not. He stood there, silent, bathing in their adoration. He did not nod, but his silence was his consent. He breathed in the blasphemous worship as a thirsty traveler drinks water. He allowed his pride to be gorged. In that moment, he accepted the final role, donning the most dangerous mask of all, the mask of a god. And it was at that very moment that the unseen director, the one who had been silently watching it all, decided that this play had gone too far. The judgment did not come later. The Bible records it with chilling finality. Immediately, while the cheers were still echoing, an invisible hand struck a fatal blow. Agrippa suddenly crumpled, his face contorted. He clutched his abdomen, a groan of agony escaping his throat, replacing the eloquent oration. The silver god had fallen. The play had reached its climax, and the final curtain was about to fall in the most horrific way imaginable. The judgment of God was not a swift sword that brought a quick and merciful death. No, the punishment for Agrippa was designed to be a mirror, a lesson seared into the memory of all who witnessed it. It was not a death, it was a slow, agonizing, and repulsive unmasking, a process that stretched over 5 days and 5 nights, exposing the inner putrefaction to the outside world. The king, who moments before had been shining like a god, was now carried by his guards into the palace like a helpless child, his body convulsing in violent abdominal pains that no physician could soothe. But that was only the beginning. This was no ordinary illness. This was a decomposition from within. Josephus and other sources describe a horrifying scene. Agrippa's body, while he was still alive, became a feast for worms. An internal invasion, an unstoppable army of tiny creatures devouring his organs. Try to imagine the sheer horror of that. The decay he had nurtured in his soul for so many years, the pride, the cruelty, the deceit, the blasphemy was now manifesting itself externally in the most graphic and disgusting way. The worms were not just a symptom of a disease, they were a symbol. They were the naked truth of his being, eating away the final vestiges of his magnificent facade. The splendid palace at Caesarea no longer echoed with music or laughter, but only with the agonizing screams of a king. Screams that were no longer the voice of a god, but the cries of a soul realizing it had gambled everything for a vain performance and lost catastrophically. The stench of decay began to permeate the marble corridors, a smell so foul that even his most loyal servants wretched and could not bear to enter his chamber. The king, who had craved the attention and worship of the masses, was now dying in a grotesque isolation. His own children could not approach their father. The mask of a father, a husband, a king, all had been ripped away. The finest physicians of the kingdom were summoned. They tried everything: rare herbs, prayer rituals, the medical practices of both Greece and Egypt. But it was all in vain. It was as if an invisible wall stood between their efforts and Agrippa's body. They were not fighting a disease. They were fighting a verdict that had already been passed. During those 5 days, Lying on his bed amidst the agony and humiliation, did Agrippa recognize his error? Josephus records that in his final lucid moments, Agrippa looked at the few friends who remained by his side and spoke bitter words, acknowledging that the God they had hailed was now dying. Perhaps in those last moments, when all the masks had been stripped away, he saw the truth. He saw the vanity of power, the emptiness of applause, and the terrible price of a single moment of pride. The last mask had fallen, and underneath there was only decay and despair awaiting the inevitable end. On the fifth day, after a hopeless struggle against a predetermined sentence, the heart of Herod Agrippa, I stopped beating. The screams ceased. A silence fell over the palace in Caesarea. The play was over. The stage was empty. The king, the actor, the master of masks, had finally faced a reality where there were no more roles to play, no more audiences to deceive. He had taken his final bow. His death was not a private tragedy, whispered in corners. It was a shocking piece of news, spreading like a seismic wave throughout Judea and all the way to Rome. But for the followers of the Way, those who had suffered his persecution, who had mourned for James and prayed for Peter, this death was not a cause for celebration. It was a terrifying confirmation. A confirmation of the teaching they held dear. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Agrippa had sown the wind of pride, and he had reaped the whirlwind of destruction. The story of the King's Play is not just a warning for kings and dictators. If it were that simple, it would have remained buried in the pages of old history books. No, this story still resonates today because the stage has changed, but the roles remain. It is a giant mirror held up to each and every one of us. In our modern world, the world of carefully curated social media profiles, of impressive job titles, of achievements we proudly display, what masks are we wearing? Are we playing the part of the perfect success story, hiding our failures and insecurities? Are we playing the part of the blissfully happy person, hiding the cracks in our relationships? And most dangerously of all, when we receive praise, recognition, or admiration, do we secretly breathe it in as Agrippa did? Do we begin to believe our own performance, to think that our success is entirely due to our own talent, forgetting the one who gave us breath, health, and opportunity? The story of Herod Agrippa forces us to ask a profound and uncomfortable question. When the curtain of our own life falls, when all the roles are over, when all the makeup is stripped away, what will be left? Will it be a humble soul, aware of its place in the universe, a soul that has lived a life of truth? Or will what remains be nothing but a pile of ashes from our prideful masks, a terrifying emptiness? The stage at Caesarea is now just stone ruins, but those stones still whisper a timeless lesson. A lesson that you can build a kingdom, you can win the hearts of men, you can stand at the pinnacle of the world and receive the acclaim of all. But there is always a line that cannot be crossed. The glory of the Creator is a sacred fire. You can warm yourself by it in humility, but if you try to steal it, it will consume you. Because in the end, there is only one audience member who truly matters, and he sees through every mask, every performance. The final glory, the ultimate power, and the last word, always, belongs to him alone. When the last cry faded in the palace at Caesarea, an unnatural silence descended. It was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating silence of awe and shame. The king's play was over, but its echoes were only just beginning to ripple outwards. The death of Herod Agrippa was not a period at the end of a sentence. It was a massive exclamation point carved into the stone of history, a warning whose sound would reverberate for all time. In the days that followed, the palace that had been the epicenter of power and splendor became a cursed place. Servants tiptoed, avoiding eye contact with one another, and especially avoiding the wing where the king had drawn his last, tormented breath. It was said that the stench of death and fear had seeped into the very marble itself, and the silver robe, that masterpiece of pride, became a damning piece of evidence. No one dared touch it. It was bundled away and hidden, as if the very threads carried the sentence of heaven. The silence in the palace was the silence of a tomb, but outside those walls, the silence was quickly broken by whispers. The story of the king's death was not announced by royal decree. It spread in a much more primal and powerful way, from mouth to ear. It was told by the soldier who had felt the crowd's terrifying hush after Agrippa's first scream. It was told by the serving girl who had caught a horrifying glimpse inside the sick room. It was told by the envoys from Tyre and Sidon who had come begging for life and had instead witnessed a judgment from on high. And most importantly, it was told by the common people who had stood in that theater, who had screamed, "The voice of a god," and now felt a cold dread crawl up their spines every time they recalled their own words. They had participated in the play, and now they felt a share of the guilt. While fear gripped those who had once admired Agrippa, a different emotion was rising in the small homes and secret gathering places of the Christians. It was not glee at the death of an enemy. No, it was a profound and holy fear. They saw in Agrippa's fall not an act of revenge, but a terrifying demonstration of the holiness and power of the God they worshipped. The king had killed James. The king had intended to kill Peter. But when that same king dared to touch the glory of God himself, he had crossed a line that not even the imperial power of Rome could protect him from. The story of Agrippa's death quickly became one of the most powerful testimonies of the early church. It was recounted to new believers to teach them of God's holiness. It was shared among those suffering persecution to remind them that even the most powerful king was merely a man before the Almighty. The event poured a kind of steel into the spine of their faith. It confirmed that their prayers had power, that God did indeed defend his people, and that no earthly force could stand against his will. And as the Bible records with a brief but potent summary immediately after narrating Agrippa's death, "But the word of God grew and multiplied." The persecutor had fallen, and the seed he had tried to stamp out now grew stronger than ever, watered by a rain of divine awe. The legacy of Herod Agrippa, in the end, was not the cities he built or the political alliances he forged. His true legacy was a cautionary tale. He, who had tried so desperately to be the protagonist of his nation's history, had ultimately become a minor character, a tragic example in the much larger story of the rise of a faith he had scorned. The stage he had tried to control so absolutely now belonged to the very people he had sought to destroy. And that story is not over. The stage at Caesarea may now be windswept ruins, but new stages are erected every day. They are built in corporate boardrooms where decisions affecting thousands of lives are made. They are built on social media platforms where we construct our own perfect images. They are built in the private theater of our own hearts and minds, where we erect pedestals and place ourselves upon them. The echo from Agrippa's stage still asks us today, which mask are you wearing? Whose applause do you crave? When success comes, when praise is given, do you take a moment to look up and acknowledge its true source? Or do you stand there silently, bathing in its glow, just for a moment too long? The story of King Herod Agrippa I is not just a tragedy of the past, it is a prophecy for the present. It reminds us that every stage will eventually go dark, every performance will end. Every round of applause will fade into silence. And when it is all over, the only thing that remains is not what we accomplished or what others said about us, but a simple question from the Supreme Director. Did you live in truth, or were you only acting? Because in the grand play of the universe, there is only one star that never fades. All glory, all power, and all worship, in this life and the next, belong to him alone, always and forever.